BloodStream is a Believe original.
A 360-degree look
at the bleeding disorders community.
The developments, the history,
the news,
and the people who shaped our world.
BloodStream is produced by Believe Limited.
Happy listening.
Hello and welcome to BloodStream, Episode 1, June 20th, 2016. I am your host, Patrick James Lynch. This month on BloodStream, we're going to talk about some recent developments in the study of inhibitors. New data has recently come out that's energized the conversation. We'll also hear from the highly accomplished Dr. Glen Pierce, who last month wrote an article in LA Kelly Communications newsletter Pen titled The Most Exciting Time in Hemophilia. He'll tell us why that is. We'll take a look ahead at the two big conferences going on this summer, the National Hemophilia Foundation's annual meeting and the much-anticipated World Federation of Hemophilia's World Congress, expected to be the largest meeting ever of people with bleeding disorders. We'll also talk about how one adventurous young man with hemophilia faced an unexpected challenge in his incredibly ambitious pursuit this summer, and how he's responded. All of that and more right after this brief word from one of our sponsors. This episode of BloodStream is brought to you in part by our presenting sponsor, Entertainment to Effect Change, a nonprofit organization dedicated to creating impactful and educational photo, video, film, and audio content that leads to positive change in the world. Entertainment to Effect Change, or EtoAC, has partnered with Believe Limited to bring you BloodStream, but they do more than podcasts. Check out etoac.org, that's E2AC.org, to see some of the awesome content that they have been creating. Everything from a feature-length documentary on a groundbreaking organization that aims to help children who stutter learn to love themselves and their stutter, to live meetups like Social Infusion, a gathering for adults attending Hemophilia Federation of America's annual symposiums and other large community meetings. E2AC, entertaining to effect change. Every month, there are literally dozens of interesting and enlightening stories about the bleeding disorders community, and if you're like me, you find most of them through social media. So every month I'll be bringing you 3 stories that really struck me, one that I liked, one that I commented on, and one that I felt compelled to share. We'll call the segment, wait for it, Like, Comment, Share. Links to each will be in the program notes for each episode on bloodstreampod.com, along with the other stories that we weren't able to get to here on the podcast. You can find them all and then like, comment, or share yourself at bloodstreampod.com. And now, here are the like, comment, and shares for this month. A story I liked on social media this month: the largest gathering of the bleeding disorders community in history is taking place this July. The National Hemophilia Foundation and the World Federation of Hemophilia are holding their conferences back-to-back in Orlando, Florida, starting July 20th and running through July 30th. I go to NHF's annual meeting every year, and more recently have started creating programs for annual meeting with my team at Believe Limited. Actually, this year we're producing and I'm hosting an award show for teens in the bleeding disorders community called the Impact Awards. It's on the first night after opening session and the opening of the exhibit hall, and an inspirational event called Powering Through on the third and final day. We'll put links to these programs on bloodstreampod.com in the program notes for episode 1. And that's the end of my shameless plug. But our programs are 2 of literally dozens. Over the course of 3 days, there are programs for everybody in the community. Programs for women about advancements in care and screening. Programs specifically tailored to the Spanish-speaking population. Art therapy programs, insurance seminars, a reception for new families. There's also an exhibit hall where you can meet industry and organizations from around the country and see the future of care through their eyes. Building all this is an extraordinary feat, and I think this year there are around 2,500 attendees from the community, and NHF does a fantastic job of making this enormous conference feel small and welcoming. If you're interested, you can still register at NHF's official website, hemophilia.org. So I love annual meeting, but what really made me click like on this story is that I get to attend my first ever World Federation of Hemophilia Congress, because it immediately follows and is hosted by NHF. This is the first time World Congress has been held in the U.S. in over 25 years. That's a long time. And 127 member organizations from around the world will be represented there. Think about that for a second. 127 organizations from around the world will be in Florida this July. One of the more exciting sessions, I think, will be a presentation from a professor and researcher from Lund University in Sweden who believes there are tools being developed today that will allow every patient around the world to receive treatment by the year 2030. I know World Federation of Hemophilia's humanitarian aid program has the motto and mission of treatment for all, and it's something that I subscribe to and am excited and inspired by. So I'm looking forward to this session and looking forward to seeing how you present that magnitude of information in a mere 30 minutes. You can register and find out session details at wfh.org. Up next, this is a story that has been circulating on social media for the last few months, and I found myself compelled to comment on it this month because it reminded me of a challenge that we often face in the bleeding disorders community. What happens when decision makers don't really understand bleeding disorders? Chris Lee is an experienced rower from the University of Georgia. 18 months ago, he and his rowing partner Jacob Pope signed up for a 2,400-mile race from Monterey, California to Waikiki, Hawaii. The race is called the New Ocean Waves Great Pacific Race, and it sounds pretty insane, taking anywhere from 1 to 3 months to complete. That is quite a spectrum, 1 to 3 months to complete. Chris Lee also has hemophilia. He was hoping to be the first person with hemophilia to complete this unbelievable race. The stress on his joints and muscles, however, would inevitably lead to bleeds, and obviously when you're in the middle of the Pacific Ocean in a boat barely bigger than you, bleeds are something of a risk. So Chris worked with his hematologist and other doctors to develop a treatment plan that he could implement while racing, a very responsible thing to do. Only problem is that at the last minute, New Ocean Wave didn't agree with the plan or felt it was too risky and ultimately dropped Chris and Jacob from the race. The guys were obviously upset. Here's an abbreviated quote from Chris from the Facebook page that he and Jacob built to track their journey. Quote, "An utter lack of understanding of my hemophilia and lack of initiative by the safety officer to develop an adequate medical evacuation contingency plan led to their untimely," again, it was 3 days before the race, "their untimely decision to pull us from the race. While New Ocean Wave, the organizer, should have made a more informed choice at a point sooner in the 18 months since we launched our campaign, there is no flexibility on this matter." Here's the comment that's the end of the quote. Now here's the comment that I want to make. So many of us know this feeling, whether it's a parent or a teacher, a coach, or some other well-meaning authority figure. We have all with hemophilia at some point or another been told, no, you can't because of your bleeding disorder. And that's a painful thing to hear, even when we know that the hesitation or the fear is warranted, knowing that deep down, you are capable of doing the thing, but being told you're not allowed to, or in some cases, talked out of doing it. I gotta be honest though, as I get a little older, I do see both sides of the issue. Experiences like this used to make me feel helpless and angry, definitely angry. There was only one side of the story. It was my side, and I was totally capable. Anyone who tried to slow me down was against me. Now I take steps to try to address the concerns far in advance while having honest conversations with my care team, with my fiance, with my closest friends about what's realistic. I manage my own expectations while respecting the opinions of people who basically just don't want me to hurt myself. I tried to become the first person with severe hemophilia to run and complete the New York City Marathon a few years ago, and everyone told me it was a bad idea. I was going to get more bleeds, and I was going to cause problems, and blah, 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 blah. And I heard it all and I welcomed it all, but I was dead set on making this effort. And I'm glad I did. I trained for 6 months. Wisely, I built a couple of different landmarks into my training regimen. I completed a half marathon, but once I completed that, the bleeding episodes that ensued were enough to tell me that this was the end of that road. My target joints were greatly impacted. I started developing problems in joints that previously hadn't had problems. And after the half marathon itself, I had trouble moving around for the better part of 5 or 6 days. I had to try, though, and I'm glad I did. I'm glad I found my limit. I'm glad I trained. I don't have any regrets. I don't wonder. I don't put my head in the pillow and think, wow, man, if only I had tried that marathon when I was a little bit younger. I learned more about healthy eating and the importance of nutrition in training for something like this. And I'm glad there were people who were concerned about my health and spoke up. Sitting around icing my lower half for about a week straight gave me a lot of time to reflect on all the concern, the chorus of concern, as it were. And without that, honestly, a lot of young people could make some really poor decisions. All that's to say, Chris Lee's situation is a complicated one that many of us will face as we navigate life with a bleeding disorder. Chris has a right to feel frustrated with how he was treated at the last minute by the race organizers, which to me is really the most offensive part of this whole thing, and he addresses it in that quote that I read. The fact that it was 3 days before when this was going on for 18 months. There was training, and they'd announced their campaign 18 months ago. 3 days before is when the organizers pulled the plug. That's a tough pill to swallow. But the race organizers are also right to be concerned to an extent. And furthermore, Chris and Jacob are right to do what they did next. They set out 1 week later, 1 week after being booted from the race at the last minute. They set out to row from Monterey to Waikiki anyway. They're highly trained athletes who have rowed for a long time. Chris has a detailed care plan in place, including emergency plans should something go really wrong. It's the right decision for them. I felt compelled to comment on this story because I hope other folks in the bleeding disorders community of all ages push themselves and make room for bleeders to push themselves while being in conversation with those who have an interest in their safety and health. We don't always need everyone to agree with us to arrive at the best decision. And I hope we all remember to be smart, careful, and preventative when we do pursue incredible things, because we are capable of incredible things. Finally, here's a story I felt compelled to share this month. Some interesting data has recently been published regarding inhibitor formation. This past December at ASH, which is the American Society of Hematology's annual meeting, the results from SIPPET, the SIPPET study, were presented along with the study's abstract. Now, SIPPET stands for the Survey of Inhibitors in Plasma Products Exposed Toddlers. The presentation back in December caused serious concern in the community because the results seemed to suggest a strong relationship between using recombinant products and developing inhibitors in previously untreated patients who have severe hemophilia A. An inhibitor, for those who aren't familiar, is an antibody or a resistance to factor. And developing an inhibitor can lead to things like longer and more severe bleeding episodes, more frequent and longer hospital stays, more permanent joint damage, missing time from work or school or social activities. They can be nasty. Then on May 27th of this year, about 6 months after the conference back in December, the New England Journal of Medicine published the completed study. And that was really the trigger for assessment, the completed study being published in a peer-reviewed journal. Now, before we get into the results that were published in the journal, it is important to note that many leading expert groups, such as MASAC, which is the National Hemophilia Foundation's Medical and Scientific Advisory Council, have not issued significant comments or recommendations yet. And I should mention the date of this recording is June 19th, 2016, which I state because depending on when you hear this, well, you may know more than I do right now. What the results of SIPPET seem to show is that in that particular study, recombinant factor VIII was associated with an 87% higher incidence of inhibitor formation than plasma-derived factor VIII containing von Willebrand factor. In human talk, the results seem to suggest that you're almost twice as likely to develop an inhibitor on recombinant factor VIII than on plasma-derived factor VIII with von Willebrand factor if you are a previously untreated patient with severe hemophilia A. But there are a lot of mitigating things about this study, a lot of variables at play. So let's take a look first at how did SIPPET arrive at this conclusion. This was a prospective study, which essentially means they were tracking the effects of both factor classes on patients who had not received factor before, previously untreated patients, commonly referred to as PUPs. And these are usually young children. You'll recall I just mentioned a couple of moments ago, the T in SIPPET stands for toddler. And as they tracked them throughout the course of the study, 29 of the 125 PUPs with severe hemophilia A, and I want to emphasize this study was looking exclusively at severe hemophilia A. 29 of the 125 PUPs who were treated with plasma-derived factor VIII containing von Willebrand factor developed an inhibitor, whereas 47 of the 126 who were treated with recombinant factor VIII developed an inhibitor. Once again, there are a lot of variables at play, And as of June 19th, MASAC has not yet made their sought-after recommendation, but these results, rightfully so, are getting a lot of attention. A hemophilia diagnosis can be scary for any patient, and learning that around 30% of hemophilia patients develop an inhibitor can be even scarier. Add to that the possibility that your child taking one type or class of product over another could significantly increase his risk of developing an inhibitor. That demands a conversation. But do we know for certain if that is the case? Do we know for certain if there is a relationship between product class and inhibitor formation in pups with severe hemophilia A? Coming up, I discuss SIPPET inhibitors and more with Dr. Glen Pierce, the former VP of Hematology at Biogen, former VP of Research at Bayer Healthcare, currently consulting with BioMarin and Genentech Roche and advising Alnylam. Glen is also a board member of the World Federation of Hemophilia and sits on NHF's MASAC, so he knows a thing or two about this subject, and we will hear from him right after this word from one of our sponsors. Once again, the presenting sponsor for this episode of BloodStream is Entertainment to Effect Change, a 501c3 dedicated to creating impactful and educational photo, video, film, and audio content that leads to positive change in the world. Visit EtoAC, that's E as in Edward, 2 as in after 1, A as in Apple, C as in Charlie.org to learn more about the awesome content and incredible events that E2AC is a part of. E2AC, entertaining to affect change. Just before we get to the interview with Glen, I want to point out, you heard me rattle off a number of his credits, and that's just a selection of them. He is a very accomplished individual. He's one of the greatest experts our community has. And he was very generous with his time. We spoke for about 90 minutes about a range of topics. However, for the podcast, we obviously had to focus that interview on a select number of topics. Given how important SIPPET is, the timeliness of conversation about inhibitor formation, and the timeliness of the World Congress being in the U.S. in July, we don't always have a great awareness here in the U.S. about the situation around the globe. Glen sits on the board of the World Federation. He had a lot to do with the expansion of the humanitarian aid program. So for the purposes of the podcast, we're focusing the conversation with Glen on the topic of inhibitors and the situation around the world. If after listening to it, you'd like to hear more from him, which I'd recommend, he's an expert, you can go to bloodstreampod.com and click on the link for the full interview in the program notes. So take a listen here, and if you want to hear more, bloodstreampod.com program notes. And now, here's my conversation with Dr. Glen Pierce. When I first heard the announcement from the World Congress in Australia about the Biogen and Sobi commitment to the World Federation of Hemophilia's humanitarian aid program, and then read the numbers and then looked at, well, what had they been receiving, and realized, oh, this is big news. I got very interested in what was going on with World and humanitarian aid program. I was with you in the delegation in Senegal back in the fall to see a center that was going to be benefiting from the expanded humanitarian aid program, the products that were coming in from that donation from Biogen and Sobi. And for all of the excitement about the state of affairs within the community, at least here in the United States, it's a much different picture abroad. You sit on the board for World Federation. You brought a Lactate and a Prolix into the world, the products that were donated that allowed for this expansion. So from your vantage point, for those who don't know about the situation around the world, can you give them an adequate overview that the average American may not be aware of?
The situation in the world is desperate. It's truly desperate. I think the statistic that is most compelling is that about 15% of the population uses 75% of the clotting factor. That leaves 25% of the clotting factor for 85% of the world. And what that really means is that the vast majority of those 85% have no clotting factor at all. So let's go back in time, 60 years. There was no clotting factor, there was no cryoprecipitate, there was marginal fresh frozen plasma. that generally caused fluid overload and congestive heart failure because it just didn't have enough factor in it to be able to stop bleeding unless you pumped hundreds of mils into patients. That's the situation we have now in the developing world, except they don't have any fresh frozen plasma either. They have nothing. They don't have ice. They don't really have access to bandages. They don't have access to casts. Certainly don't have access to braces, physical therapy. Nothing at all. In fact, in many cases, and in most cases, they're not even diagnosed with hemophilia. The median age of death in the developing world where there's minimal access to product is 10. It means half the people are dead after age 10 or by age 10. People are dying on a daily basis from hemophilia in the developing world. One of the most compelling things that happened to me on a recent trip to Kenya, I was in Eldoret, which is a town of about 1 million people in Kenya. They've got a good medical school and hemophilia treatment center there, supported in part by the Indiana Hemostasis and Thrombosis Center over the past 6 or 7 years. And we went out to visit a patient in his home. One of the interesting things that happened is that the entire neighborhood turned out for the event, because this was a big deal. We looked at the patient's living situation, worked with the parents to help the patient in his mobility. But because so many people came, and because they broadcast the news about this home visit from these hemophilia docs, these 2 guys that were 26 years old also came. One was a distant relation to the proband, the kid with hemophilia that we went to visit. The other was no relation at all. As we looked at their knees, it became clear within seconds both of these guys had severe or moderate hemophilia. They had knees that looked like they had lots of bleeding over the years.
Did they come to get looked at, or were they just there because it was an event?
No, so people spread the word that they were, that people that knew something about bleeding were going to come.
Right.
And so these guys just they showed up. The one distant cousin showed up because he had a connection to the family. The other one had heard about it just through the broader neighborhood. And so that gives you, I think, a prime example. Here you've got 2 26-year-old guys. They're somewhat crippled at this point, unable to work, didn't finish much school, had never been diagnosed with hemophilia, but suffered all their lives with uncontrolled bleeding. The first thing that you would say is that it's amazing they're alive. And in fact, most of the 26-year-old guys like them are not. They've already died.
How does the average person have an impact on the global community? If someone was inspired to want to make a difference, what can that person do to feel as though they're contributing toward this massive, to use your word, desperate need?
There are several things that we as individuals can do here in the developed world. We could encourage other manufacturers to make donations. No one else is making a donation like this, and yet other manufacturers are selling hundreds of millions to billions of dollars worth of product per year.
Yeah, how do we change that? Like that, let's start there, because that's the big... I can donate a little bit of money towards something, and not to belittle that, but that's nothing like a $1 billion donation of product or 1 billion unit donation of product. How do we incentivize other companies to donate on a predictable, sustainable basis?
I don't know that I have the answer to that because no one else has really stepped up at these levels. But companies respond to their constituents. They respond to their customers. I think as customers, both hemophilia treatment centers as well as patients, can ask, how about it? How about making some donations to people that are much less fortunate than us who don't have access to product?
It feels like it needs some kind of organized...
groundswell.
Yeah.
I've been working in the biotech industry my whole career. We have good profit margins in biotech. We take a lot of risks. Many times drugs don't work. They fall by the wayside in early stage clinical trials. Some even fall by the wayside in late stage clinical trials that have already eaten up hundreds of millions of dollars from the company. Nonetheless, we can look at the annual reports of companies, and we can see that the profits are good. We're not talking about a lot of money here to donate product to the developing world. The cost of goods is relatively low, and that's really all it costs in order to do that.
The rate of inhibitor formation in the developed world is probably the greatest to be tackled issue here. Is that fair enough?
I think it's one of the biggest issues. Fully stopping arthropathy probably is a second major issue.
Fair enough. Okay. So it would be remiss to not at least mention SIPPET. And again, for context, this is May 31st. Friday, so what, the 28th, a few days ago, the last business day, yesterday was Memorial Day, the New England Journal of Medicine published the peer-reviewed article, right? That was on Friday. That was after the abstract had come out and caused some stir during ASH, and I guess it was December. And then there were just months of this. I still find this part of the process, because I'm new to paying attention to things like this, find it fascinating that an abstract comes out, all these feelings and conversations can occur, but no meaningful action can actually be taken until it's published and the appropriate committees assess it and review it with full data. So there's just this weird period where people kind of are anxious, and now it has been published, so that anxiety is seeking some kind of relief. I think it would be unfair of me to ask you specifically about your take on it. You sit on MASAC. You have a voice in what MASAC will ultimately do in response to this, and that process is already underway. Again, first business day since it's come out, that process is underway. So I want to leave discussion about that particular study to the side in favor of a greater conversation about inhibitors, because that study, as it was, it's looking at pups, previously untreated patients, which are often toddlers, newly diagnosed. So for those newly diagnosed families that may be listening to this conversation, the people who theoretically would be most impacted by the results of a study like SIPPET, what are inhibitors and why do they form?
Inhibitors are neutralizing antibodies to factor VIII. And so we all have an immune response. We respond to foreign antigens or foreign proteins that may come into our system, and we'll make an antibody to it. That antibody could be to the surface of proteins that sit on influenza viruses or other types of viruses that cause diseases. It could be to proteins that we would be exposed to, such as allergens, that would get into our system. And it could even be to self-antigens, to self-proteins, and that constitutes autoimmune diseases. So diseases like lupus or rheumatoid arthritis, we're making antibodies to our own proteins, and that's causing damage and destruction to whatever that protein is involved in. The SIPPET study, which is a randomized prospective study, so it's got a lot of power behind it, has shown an increase in neutralizing antibody formation or inhibitor formation with recombinant factor VIII compared to plasma-derived factor VIII. That is a unique study. The geography where it occurred is unique. The methods that they used are somewhat different than some of the other methods. So it remains to be seen how this study compares to the previous studies that have been published, and how we might interpret the increase they found in light of the lack of increase in inhibitor formation others have found with recombinant factor VIII.
Stop the Bleeding has been recognized with major awards from organizations such as the Hemophilia Federation of America and the National Hemophilia Foundation, and you can find all of the Stop the Bleeding episodes and additional content at stbhemo.com, including our episodes from Season 6, which just launched only a few weeks ago. stbhemo.com. Why is it so challenging to understand more about inhibitor formation? Because this 20 to 30% figure of people who will develop it. That's been the figure for quite some time now. I'm sure it's very complex, but for frustrated parents or frustrated patients, what's the simplest way to communicate why this has been particularly challenging to make significant progress on?
Our immune system is an incredibly complicated black box. That is the simplest explanation. And while the development of HIV and AIDS research has greatly enhanced our understanding of the immune system over these past 30 years, we would be even farther behind if HIV had not come along, because it destroys the immune system. And so the whole process of understanding how that happens has increased our understanding by leaps and bounds.
Interesting.
But we still don't really understand it. We don't understand how a response gets mounted. We don't understand why responses don't get mounted throughout our lives. Throughout our lives, our proteins are mutating, for instance, in our bodies. We have trillions of cells in our bodies. We are replicating those cells at varying rates. Mistakes occur in replication of cells, mistakes to the DNA that can result in small mutations in proteins, and yet we never develop antibodies to those proteins. Why is that? So there's lots of fundamental questions about the immune system that we don't understand. And unfortunately for us in hemophilia, we don't understand what triggers it to factor VIII and what prevents it. So we see these risk factors, but we don't see the primary event that triggers the inhibitor. They're just risk factors. That means it predisposes you to getting an inhibitor, but doesn't guarantee it.
How do we balance the importance of a process like what MASAC undertakes to consider all the factors associated with analyzing a study and also operate with a healthy sense of urgency? How scientifically, beyond just hemophilia, but with any study that signifies potentially some very important information, how is that balanced?
In the case of inhibitors, we've known about them, for somewhere beyond 60 years, I think. So this has been something that's been known to immunologists as well as to the hematologists for a long period of time. Since I've been around for much of that time, I have never seen a call to action on inhibitors by our community. I don't know that we can fault a single institution for something like that, but we can ask a single institution to perhaps make a call for action, and maybe it's time for that. My hope is that the outcome of the SIPPET study will produce a call for action to mount a major offensive against inhibitors. I want to come back to one other issue, and that's the risk-benefit relationship of taking plasma-derived products, of taking recombinant products. Since we put viral inactivation processes in place more than 30 years ago now, we have really had no transmission of hepatitis viruses or HIV since 1987. So that's a remarkable accomplishment given the amount of plasma-derived product that's been administered around the world. So we're doing great on that. What we're not doing so great on is preventing viruses that are not susceptible to these viral inactivation technologies from getting through. There's one virus in particular, parvovirus, B19, which, although we've taken steps to minimize it, we still see an increase in antibody formation in patients with hemophilia compared to other normal individuals that haven't taken plasma-derived products. We don't see it with patients who have taken recombinant products. So some of it's getting through. It's a benign virus. It's not likely to cause a significant problem, but it points to the ability to escape the detection system and the prevention system that we have for plasma-derived products. When we think about the number of viruses that have emerged over the past 10 or 20 years, our ability to detect them is much improved. look at how quickly we've detected Zika virus and identified its pathology and what it does in pregnant women. And we've identified its epidemiology, how it's transmitted, and its geographical localizations. And we've all done that. We've done all that in just a few months. So that's remarkable. But we don't want to get ourselves into a situation with so-called silent killers. HIV and hepatitis C don't cause any disease when they first infect you. That means you don't know about it until after you've been infected for a while. And while we've got good inactivation techniques for lipid-enveloped viruses like those, we don't have those techniques for the non-lipid enveloped viruses like parvo. And that's something always to keep in mind.
That example right there of the unknown pathogen or the parvo virus existing in patients who are taking plasma-derived products just goes to show it's not as simple as sometimes it can appear to be when you start digging into all the implications of any given decision. So I think that's an important part of the argument to keep in mind.
Prior to the HIV epidemic, we had a very paternalistic and sometimes maternalistic medical profession. They made decisions for you. You didn't make decisions as the patient. We fought that in hemophilia. I can remember my mom fighting that when I was growing up prior to HIV. But that was the medical system during that period of time. AIDS stopped that. And it stopped it for the benefit of many, many other diseases, including hemophilia. So as we look at this new situation or a situation 5 years from now where we're going to be faced with other questions about which product to use, we need to remember that the medical profession doesn't make those kinds of decisions unilaterally. We need to get the information as patients, consumers, as caregivers. We need to work with our physicians and nurses at the hemophilia treatment centers to come up with the best treatment plan for us individually. But we're now in an era of personalized medicine. We can identify some risk factors for inhibitors, for instance, in patients, and we should be looking at all of the data as we make individual treatment decisions.
That's a good point, and it can sound like a cop-out when a recommendation of any kind medically ends with consult with your care team and physician on what might be the right decision for you. I think it's tempting sometimes as patients and as human beings to just say like, just tell me what to do. Just give me the answer. I just want to know. But it's not that's not how it works. That is not a system of empowerment or progress. That is a very passive, lazy, and potentially catastrophic system.
That didn't work so well.
We tried that.
Yes.
Swing and a miss. I think we've done good work here. I've kept you longer than I anticipated, but thank you so much for the time, Glenn.
You're quite welcome, Patrick. I've enjoyed this conversation quite a bit.
Me too. We'll do it again.
Okay.
BloodStream would once again like to recognize our interview sponsor, Stop the Bleeding. Stop the Bleeding, the comedic web series about bleeding disorders that uses entertainment and digital content to educate and empower our community. You can find all of the episodes and our additional content, such as the behind-the-scenes videos and our unique STB activity book, by visiting our website, stbhemo.com. That's S for Samuel, T for Thomas, B for Bravo, Hemo for Hemophilia, stbhemo.com. I want to thank Dr. Glen Pierce for sitting down and speaking with me so openly and candidly about, again, a number of topics. You heard about a few of them here. You can hear the full-length interview at bloodstreampod.com in the program notes. I appreciate his perspective on the situation around the world and his commitment to making that an important part of the conversation here in the United States. I think it's easy for us to forget that somewhere in the vicinity of 80% of people around the world don't have access to sustainable therapy or care. Half of people born with hemophilia die before the age of 10. This is a critical situation, and he is helping keep it front of mind for us here, and I appreciate that very much. I want to finish up, though, by coming back to inhibitors and SIPPET. There's a lot of anxiety in the community, and in friends that I have who have inhibitors, whose kids have inhibitors. We have not made significant progress in 30 years, and Glenn and I talked about that. And when he says the immune system is a complicated black box, I understand that. And I also understand why parents of people with inhibitors are frustrated and wanting answers. I had an inhibitor. I remember what that's like. It is a different quality of life. But it's important to understand that no two bodies are alike. And while we are getting more information and more data about inhibitor formation, we are not getting the Holy Grail in SIPPET. We are not getting the Holy Grail in any study to date. We are simply getting more information. In SIPPET alone, while there was a higher incidence of inhibitor formation in those on the recombinant products, 29 out of the 125 people on the plasma-derived with von Willebrand factor developed an inhibitor. That's more than 20%. That's far too high. This is not an either-or proposition. And there are so many different risk factors that we only have a surface-level understanding of. So what can we do? As a patient community, what do you do? In my opinion, it is our prerogative to take in as much information as possible. Read the SIPPET study. Read all of the articles that will be written by people in response to the SIPPET study. Read MASAC's recommendation. Talk to your hematologist and care team at your HTC. Assess the risk factors of this product class over that product class. Assess your individual or your child's likelihood or risk factors connected to developing an inhibitor, and make the best decision you can and realize there's not a clear, simple answer. We just don't have that advancement yet. And while it is frustrating that in 30 years we've made very little progress, 30 years prior to that, if you were born with severe hemophilia, you did not see 30 years old. So in context of our community's history, considering 80% of the world doesn't have access to care, considering only a few decades ago in this country, adulthood was a dream if you had severe hemophilia, this is the most exciting time in hemophilia. There are products just around the corner that have tremendous promise. Meanwhile, there's this huge problem that we still struggle to make significant progress on. It's complicated, and we have to get comfortable with that. Also, by the time you're listening to this, there may very well be updates to the ongoing SIPPET story. We'll post updates that occur before our next episode airs in the Episode 1 program notes. There you'll also find, as I mentioned earlier, dozens of other interesting stories, scientific and medical updates, as well as original articles from the BloodStream team. So visit bloodstreampod.com and check out the Episode 1 program notes. Thank you for listening to this episode of BloodStream, the monthly podcast for all things bleeding disorders. If you'd like us to listen to you now, you can email us at mailbag@bloodstreampod.com. Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/bloodstreampod. Our Twitter handle is bloodstreaminfo. I know, I wanted Bloodstream Pod too, but apparently it's not available, though we are working on it. Subscribe to us on iTunes or Stitcher or wherever you're listening to this. We would really appreciate it. BloodStream would like to thank our presenting sponsor, EtoAC Entertainment to Effect Change, for their support of this episode. EtoAC.org to learn more about this nonprofit organization's dedication to creating impactful educational photo, video, film, and audio content. EtoAC.org. EtoAC, entertaining to effect change. BloodStream is written by me, Patrick James Lynch, Lauren Feehan, and Ryan Gielen, produced by me, Andrew Gall, and Ryan Gielen, and edited by Andrew Gall. Big thanks to everyone at Believe for chipping in, and huge thanks to those amazing voices in our opening bumper, the Berenson family, the Kenny Gould family, and Glenn Moniz. Thank you for lending your voice to our podcast. My name is Patrick James Lynch, and until next time, take self-care of yourself.